For those unaware, there's been quite the spirited discussion on some of my YouTube videos, mostly by self-identified libertarians and anarchists who take issue with my statements that their ideas are unjustified and unjustifiable. But those comments have been, almost without exceptions, little more than, "I'm right because I'm right, so there." I've asked for them to validate their ideas, and I got this video, among others, thrown my way. Therefore, I'd like to take a look at libertarianism and property rights from first principles and see if it explains why they think what they think and if their claims are logically and rationally justified. I'm not holding my breath, but let's see. But first, I want to address something that keeps coming up, and I want to make myself clear. I'm talking about things that self-identified libertarians are saying. That doesn't mean that I'm accusing all libertarians of holding the same position. It just gets tiring to have to keep specifying this only applies to people who actually think this way. That ought to be understood, and there are a lot of people out there who don't seem to get that. If I'm saying something that doesn't apply to you, don't take it personally. This goes for everyone. Stop pretending that because someone uses a label that you identify with, they're aiming it directly at you. That's not the case. Thank you.
Here's the thing about logic. It's completely objective. There's no my logic or your logic. There's just logic. So if you have a logical position, then it's an objective argument that stems from first principles.
Well, yes and no. It's only logical if it actually follows the objective laws of logic. You'd think that was pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people in all walks of philosophical life engage in gross logical fallacies while pretending to be logical in their reasoning. One thing that I see often is that before they try to reason their way through a conundrum, they will identify a goal that they want to reach and then only look at evidence that supports their goal while ignoring all evidence that does not. This is a logical fallacy. Now, I make a lot of comparisons between libertarianism and religion because, unfortunately, they share a lot in common. Therefore, I'll provide a religious example that a lot of us have run into. Theists will claim that they are going to evaluate the origin of the universe, but they will only do so in the context of the existence of their particular God. They don't examine the whole of the evidence and let it lead to a conclusion, whatever it may be. They cherry-pick the evidence and only pay attention to things that support their preconceived notion. I've noticed the exact same mindset from libertarians. They identify how they'd really like the world to be, and amazingly enough, after they twist and turn through the evidence and logic, that's how it comes out to be. Therefore, I'm going to be very critical of that kind of thing and point it out wherever I see it, which I suspect is going to be a lot.
First principles are foundational propositions and axioms that do not have to be defended.
And immediately we run into a problem. Axioms are only axioms when they are self-evidently true. They exist in debate only when all parties agree to accept them as true without comment. You don't just get to decide that you're going to believe things that have no evidence and declare them axioms because you really want them to be true. I have seen in religious arguments theists declaring the existence of their gods to be axiomatic. They think that they win by default because they cannot imagine that their beliefs are not true. That's not logic. And getting back to libertarianism, since I do not accept their axioms, everything is up for grabs and they have to defend all of their ideas.
As long as your argument is purely from first principles, meaning that it's linked back to these first principles with no breaks in the chain and no fallacious reasoning, then you don't actually need empirical evidence to support it, because then the only way for the conclusion to be wrong would be for these first principles to be wrong as well.
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? If your first principles can be wrong, but you don't feel like you have to defend them, then how do we know if they're right or wrong? Simply wanting them to be right doesn't mean that they're right, and since I don't accept that they're automatically right, they need to be demonstrated. When are you going to get around to doing that?
The first principle we'll look at is a foundational principle of all logic and reason, the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be A and not A at the same time. Also, if something is A, then it cannot be B if A and B are mutually exclusive. It may be possible for something that is A to later turn into B, but once it does, it cannot be A anymore.
Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the basic laws of logic. They are accepted as true and are true axioms under the definition I gave earlier. While I will point out any potential pitfalls as he goes, Shane Killian is doing a pretty good job at laying them out, and I think that everyone really needs to have a solid grounding in basic logic because it impacts pretty much everything that we do. I want to make it clear that when I was talking about first principles, I was not referring to the basic laws of logic. I was talking about things that people draw from them and then pretend are just as valid as they are.
Directly from this we get the consistency principle. In logic, consistency means that you don't contain any contradictions. So long as the principle of non-contradiction holds, the consistency principle does as well. While there are proofs of consistency, for purposes of this video, we'll just look at falsifiability. If we can find inconsistency in a posit, then the posit must be rejected. So if A and B are mutually exclusive and a true dichotomy, then falsifying A is all that you have to do to support B and vice versa. Ironically, the consistency principle itself can be supported in this way. Consider the following claims. Consistency is preferable. Consistency is not preferable. This is a true dichotomy. One or the other must be true, but both cannot be. But if we examine these statements, we see that consistency is not preferable is a consistent principle, and therefore self-contradictory. By the principle of non-contradiction, we therefore reject it and accept consistency as being preferable.
That's all well and good as far as that goes, but there is more to it. This is particularly true when you start to talk about falsifiability, because then you also have to consider unfalsifiability. One of the basic principles of logic is the idea that any idea must be open to being falsified. There must be some circumstance that can be imagined where, if some evidence came up, it would make the statement false, and therefore it must be rejected. This comes up in religion a lot, where they will make statements that cannot conceivably be falsified. There is no set of conditions that can possibly exist where the proposition is not true. In other words, they make a statement that is true by definition because it cannot possibly be false. This is not a logically constructed argument and thus fails any credible test.
It's the consistency principle that leads us to establish burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the active side, not the passive side. There are a lot of things you're not doing right now. Maybe you're not collecting stamps at the moment. You're not walking on the moon. You're not inventing the hoverboard. You're not annexing the Sudetenland. There's an infinity of things you're not doing at the time. Imagine if someone said you had to justify every single one of them. There's no way you could do it. It would be inconsistent for someone to insist that you had to justify one or some of the things you're not doing, since you can't possibly justify them all. The only principle consistent with the consistency principle is that if you're not doing something, you don't have to justify it to anybody. The burden of proof is never on the passive side. Which means that the burden of proof must be on the active side when the active side conflicts with the passive side. In the theism-atheism debate, atheists take the passive side. They see no reason to believe in God, so they decline to. You don't have to defend not believing in God any more than you have to defend not inventing the hoverboard. But since belief is active, the theist is taking the active position, and therefore the burden of proof is on those who claim that God exists. Let me be clear about this. We're talking about the burden of proof. We are not concluding that it is always right and proper to take the passive side. Sometimes the passive side might well be in the wrong. But if you want to claim that the passive side is wrong, the burden of proof is on you to establish that. Everything so far is absolutely consistent with established logic, and you cannot doubt any of this without running afoul of the basic principles of logic and rational thought. They are the basis of all science and reason. You cannot reject the principles we've talked about so far without rejecting all of science and reason as well.
I let him run a little long there because I think he did an admirable job of explaining the burden of proof. I might not use the terms active and passive as he did, although there's nothing wrong with them. I've always said that the burden of proof is always on the positive claimants. If you make a positive claim that something is true or not true, then you need to produce evidence for your claims. If you simply are doubting the truth of the claim, you bear no burden of proof. You are not arguing that any position is true, you're just pointing out that the burden of proof of the positive claimant has not been met. Now, of the three, I would say that this is the most important logical law to keep in mind because it is where most debates run afoul of rational principles. You get a lot of theists, as Killian said, people who have the burden to prove the existence of their God, who will instead turn around and say, "Prove me wrong." I don't have to prove you wrong. You have to prove yourself right. These debates are not between there is a God and there is no God. They are almost always between there is a God and I don't believe you. This is where we get to a common logical fallacy, shifting the burden of proof. That's where one side says, I can't prove what I'm saying is true, therefore I'm going to push it on my opponent to prove that I'm wrong, and if they can't, I can claim victory without ever having proven myself right. I have to admit that so far, this has been a really cool and well done video. Good job, Mr. Killian.
Now, going from nothing more than these first principles, let's see how this works in the libertarian status debate. Force is active. Ergo, those who want to use force have the burden of proof. Those who do not have no such burden at all. There really is no way around this. If someone's just sitting there not doing anything, the burden is on you to justify any action taken against him, like, say, taking some of his money. And you can't worm your way out of this just by calling yourself a government. That is a blatant violation of the consistency principle. You can't have different rules for government than you do for the rest of us. Even if the person is taking an action, if everyone affected by the action agrees to it, the burden of proof is on you if you want to interfere. So if one person hires another, and that person agrees to work for wages of $7 an hour, and you think that's too low, that it should be $10 or $15 an hour, the burden of proof is on you to justify your intrusion into this voluntary, private, peaceful exchange. So I know...
And it all goes right out the window. He's already framing the question as a means to shift the burden of proof. Why? Because the libertarian position is immediately that force is wrong, force is bad, but they have not demonstrated that this is the case. They've only asserted it. We haven't even set the ground rules. Is force good or is it bad? Is force necessary or is it unnecessary? Does force happen in the real world or does it not? And why? There is a case to be made on both sides, but libertarians don't want to address this. They just want to pretend that it's automatically so and point fingers at the other guy. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. And then he gets really ridiculous, saying that you can't have different rules for the government than you do for the people. Of course you can. We do it all the time. You can't vote until you're 18. That's a different rule for people over 18 and people under 18. You don't get to legally drive unless you have a license. That's a different rule for people who have one and for people who don't. We have parking places for people with disabilities. That's one rule set for one group of people and another rule set for another. This happens every single day. In fact, I don't think you could go through a day without running into it. Libertarians may not like this fact. I don't know. I've never really asked. But that doesn't stop it from being a fact.
So I know you statists are now chomping at the bit, getting your arguments all ready to justify the forceful actions your government does. But hold on, because initiation of force cannot be defended.
And that is a positive claim. So prove it. Back it up with evidence, not assertion. It's okay. I'll wait.
Person A hires person B at $7 an hour. Person C, thinking person B should be paid at least $10 an hour, wants to point a gun at person A and make him pay person B more money.
Please show me where that has ever happened. Where has anyone ever pointed a gun at another person to demand that they pay someone more? See, that's one of these things about libertarianism. They use purposely inflammatory language to get people to react emotionally because they cannot convince people to react intellectually. So they make claims of physical violence as a first option, they pretend that people are pointing guns at each other, etc., but that's just not happening, at least not enough to make these examples viable. If you have to appeal to emotion, another logical fallacy, then your argument simply isn't that strong.
Is he justified in this? Think about it. What if person A then wants to point a gun back at person C because he doesn't want to be forced to do something he doesn't want to do? What's person C going to do? Say that person A doesn't get to use force, even though person C is doing what he's doing through force? How does person C have any legitimacy here at that point? It gets worse. Let's say that person D disagrees with person C's interference and points a gun at him. If the initiation of force is defensible, then who is acting in the wrong here?
First off, this is an absurd example because these kinds of decisions are not made by individuals. They're made by societies. They are made by large groups of people determining acceptable social behaviors within that society. A business owner is held accountable to the dictates of the people and their legislative arm, the government, by the fact that they are required to obtain a business license in order to open shop. If they fail to follow the prescribed laws regarding labor or safety or food handling or whatever, they can lose that license and they are no longer going to have a business. Libertarians are free not to like that fact, but it doesn't stop it from being a fact. Otherwise, you have anarchy. There has never been a successful society in all of human history where you've had no laws, no regulations, no rules, and no social codes of conduct. If you think that there is, if you think there ever has been, you're off in La La Land.
And even worse, after person C makes person A pay person B more money, person E points a gun at person C and makes him do something he thinks he should do, like give up his collection of pornography. How does person C have any logical defense if he wants to complain about it? Under the consistency principle, if one is valid, the other must be too.
Which isn't necessarily the case. That's like saying that if it is illogical to stop person A from owning pornography, then it is equally illogical to stop person B from shooting person C. Or maybe person D wants to strap a bomb vest on and go blow up his school. You can't stop him, right? There's a reason they say that consistency is the hobgoblin of weak minds. Libertarians certainly don't want anarchy to reign, even the real crazy ones, because without order, you have no society. You just have a bunch of people driving down the road Mad Max style, killing people for fun because no one can stop them. And if they want to be really consistent, then they cannot use force against those using force. It just spirals into insanity.
The only way compatible with the consistency principle is that the initiation of force is never justified, which means that the non-initiation of force principle, also known as the non-aggression principle, the basis of all libertarianism, is the only principle compatible with consistent logic. And since this argument was made in an unbroken chain from first principles, you cannot refute it. Your only recourse is to try to find a flaw in my logic up to this point, some link in the chain that was skipped or doesn't work for some reason. That is the only option to you if you want to deny the non-aggression principle.
Done and done. But I've already shown that to be completely ridiculous. Let's not forget that this nonsense just doesn't work in the real world. It's a complete fantasy. We already know what happens when we apply libertarian principles. Things fall apart. That's why we have things like the minimum wage, because companies were paying their employees a pittance and nobody would pay them more. That was the era of child labor, unsafe workspaces, company towns, and virtual slave labor. That's why we don't do it that way anymore. We tried it. It didn't work. Libertarianism is magical thinking. It asserts that if we take away all the controls and all the protections, that everyone will be nice and cooperative, and we know that's just not the case. They think that when they get out to the wastelands, they're going to be Lord Humongous, but in reality, they're going to be that guy strapped to the front of his car.
It's now time to turn to the basis for all libertarian political policy: property rights. While non-initiation of force is the guiding principle, property rights is the logical structure we use to determine who is initiating force and when. This isn't a pragmatic idea. It, too, is based on first principles. We start with the principle of self-ownership. Basically, you own yourself. You own your body, your mind, your time, and the fruits of your labors. Why? Well, what would it mean if you didn't? Who else would own you? If someone else can own you, that would make you their slave. But slavery completely violates the consistency principle. Who gets to own slaves, and who is subject to being enslaved? You would be making different rules for different people, which you don't get to do.
And that's already been completely debunked. But hey, I can go on. What about criminals in prison? Certainly, they don't own their own time. They can't control where they go and what they do. They're told what to do, when to do it, and how long it can take. The only way to be consistent is if you just let everyone out, and that's just crazy talk. I have to work. If I don't work, I don't make money, and I can't buy food or clothes or keep a roof over my family's head. Therefore, even though the agreement between myself and my employer is voluntary, I still have controls on my time and on my actions that I really have no choice over. If I quit, my family starves. If I don't show up on time, I get fired and my family starves. If I don't do the job as my employer wants me to do, I get fired and my family starves. I think you can see a pattern here. In fact, the only consistent way that you can get complete bodily autonomy with no consequences is socialism, and the libertarians don't like that one either. Make up your minds. Besides, the whole thing is based around another logical fallacy, the argument from consequences. The whole thing argues that you own yourself because the consequences of not owning yourself are unwanted. That's not a reason, and the fact that you can come up with example after example after example where owning yourself and controlling yourself is simply not permissible is enough reason to throw this one in the dumper.
Even if your answer is that no one would own you, you still have a problem. If something isn't owned, then no one can stop someone from doing whatever they want to it. If no one owns a rock, there's nothing stopping anyone from picking it up and using it for whatever purpose they want. So if no one owns you, then anyone can do whatever they want to you, including raping and murdering you.
Of course they can. I can stop anyone from doing anything I want, so long as my actions are not illegal. A piece of paper on the ground isn't owned by anyone, but that doesn't mean that someone can just come along and light it on fire and leave it burning in the street. You can't just pick up a rock and throw it wildly either, and you certainly can't go throwing it at anyone. Is it that hard to understand? And no, people can't just rape and murder you either, because we have laws against that. You can make laws about anything with no logical justification. I take it you haven't seen some of our laws. Has this never occurred to these people?
So you run into a problem with the consistency principle again. Since ownership of something means having control over what happens to it, the only consistent principle is self-ownership, which means that you get to make the decisions that affect only yourself, and you get to defend yourself against others who would impose their will on you. Giving anyone else the legitimacy to do so runs into fundamental inconsistency problems. That would mean you can't defend yourself. That would mean that no one else has any legitimacy in stopping them. And what happens if someone else wants to rape you instead? How do you determine which of them has the right to rape you? Get the picture?
So, what about your child? Do you not get to make decisions that affect them? Do you not have control over them? If they want to run away from home, do we just let them go? After all, we can't keep them captive in our homes if they don't want to stay, right? And they can reject medical treatment because they don't like doctors. Clearly, nobody in their right mind would agree to this. Does your 8-year-old get to pick up a gun and defend themselves from your will? And nobody has any rights to rape you because rights are determined by society, and if society has not granted that right to anyone, it doesn't exist. I do get the picture. I can see clearly that when there are so many exceptions that clearly falsify this position, no one ought to take this position seriously. So why do you?
So self-ownership is the only consistent way, and that naturally leads to private property. How can one claim ownership over private property? Only if it's an extension of one's right to self-ownership. So someone can own something one of two ways. 1. He can do it himself, or make it himself, or whatever. So long as he doesn't intrude on anyone else's property rights to do so, whatever is the product of his own actions, his own mind, his own labor, rightly belongs to him and no one else.
I could probably go for that in a limited fashion, but since there's probably very little that you can do today entirely on your own, I don't know how much that really matters. I mean, unless you're out collecting tree branches from a forest that isn't owned or controlled by someone else and fashioning sticks into crude implements, you're pretty much relying on someone else for your material supplies, your ideas, etc. Nobody is self-sufficient these days. Nobody.
2. He can trade for it, or otherwise convince the proper owner of something to transfer ownership to him. If he makes an axe, he can trade it for a saw, and the saw is his. Likewise, the other person gives up the saw, and takes ownership of the axe.
And that gets potentially problematic. I know they're going to say something about force, but what if you just intimidate someone into giving you their property? There's no actual use of force, and I know they use force as a generic term, but if there's no actual use of force, or maybe more properly, no demonstrable use of force, is that a legitimate way to gain property? Sure, Your Honor, he just gave me his car. Really?
Or he can trade his labor. He can agree to work a certain number of hours and receive property in return. For example, he might do some work for his landlord in exchange for letting him stay there. In fact, he can engage in any kind of voluntary contract he wants, except one. There's one piece of property he owns that he can never give up. Himself. You can give an axe because the axe can be separated from you. You can donate your kidney because your kidney was separated from you. But there's no way you can be separated from yourself. No matter where you go, there you are.
But can you sell your kidney? That's a question, and under current laws, you cannot. Besides, there goes that consistency thing. If you can sell anything that you own and you own yourself, you must be able to sell yourself. If you cannot, then you are violating the law of consistency, and there you go. The fact that there are so many exceptions to their rules shows that they aren't at all consistent. If you want to sell yourself into permanent slavery, why should you be prevented from doing so?
So although the consistency principle allows for the trading of private property, it doesn't actually let you transfer ownership of yourself. Any contract where you sell yourself into slavery is therefore completely invalid. But an axe, or a few hours a day, you can voluntarily trade that for whatever you believe is fair. Normally, of course, these exchanges are made for money because barter gets out of hand really fast. So you're more likely to sell your axe or work for a certain wage. You can then use the money to trade for other things in the economy. Money is just another form of property. It simply has the features of being a medium of exchange and a store of value. There's nothing special about it. Working for someone in exchange for money in no way makes you a slave or anything else statists like to bleat on about.
Well, that's funny because I hear libertarians whining about people being wage slaves all the time. Consistency, my ass. And while he keeps saying that you can't sell yourself into slavery, he hasn't explained exactly why. It's just another bald assertion without evidence or reason. It casts the individual as a special case that has not been earned. Of course, we know why. It's all emotional, and it also gets around the tremendously unpopular idea of slavery. After all, if you can sell yourself into slavery, then the ownership of people is fine and dandy under libertarian thought, and that's not something they'd ever want to admit to.
By the same token, there's no legitimacy whatsoever to the claim that we don't own money, it's all the government's. If you received it in exchange for your labor, you own it. To say anything else would be to deny self-ownership and all the principles on which it is based, and that would make the person a slave, as well as violating the consistency principle and therefore all of science and reason.
And nobody says that. Well, nobody but libertarians. I can't tell you how many times I've heard libertarians complain that money, because it isn't backed by gold or some other precious commodity, has no actual worth. It's just valueless paper that exists only because of the government. You also have to specify that you only own your money if it is a result of your legal labor. If you go and rob a bank, then the money isn't yours just because you worked hard to get it. The fact is, money is just a placeholder for barter. It takes the place of a pig or a chicken or a cow. The only place the government holds in the chain is guaranteeing that money has a consistent value, that the dollar bill isn't worth 5 cents here and $12 over there. Of course, you do own your own money, but that doesn't mean that you can do whatever the hell you want with it. There are limits on all freedoms, whether libertarians like it or not. You cannot go and hire a hitman with your money. Actually, that brings up something else that I bet libertarians have no way to justify. Why can't you hire a hitman? After all, you are just trading your money to someone else in exchange for a service. You are not initiating any force whatsoever. You're just paying for said force to be done. The hitman is initiating the force. So should hiring hitmen be legal? If not, why not? Consistency, people. Give it a shot. And please, let me laugh for a while over the idea that rejecting any of this somehow violates science. Science in no way has anything to do with philosophy. The The reverse may be true in some situations, but as stated, fuck no.
So from nothing more than a logical examination of first principles, we come to the following inescapable conclusion. Taking of legitimately owned property cannot be defended.
Well, yes and no. Considering all the logical inconsistencies and the number of exceptions they've had to make to their supposedly consistent principles, I'm sure this is going to go nowhere fast. Certainly you'd like to think that anything that you legitimately own is yours, but as with everything else, it isn't quite as simple as that, and I'm sure we'll see that in a moment.
Owning property is passive. Taking that property is active. At the very least, as we discussed earlier, the burden of proof is on the side of the property taker. This is why a plaintiff in court must prove his case before the court will pass a judgment for compensation. The only time this is legitimate is when the person has taken or damaged his property or otherwise not lived up to his end of a contract. If person A has stolen property from person B, he can be made to give it back or give the equivalent amount of money. Likewise, if person A damages person B's property, person A can be made to pay damages to fix everything. Or if person A borrows money from person B to buy a house and then doesn't pay it back, person B can then foreclose on person A's house. But when there has been no contract, no taken or damaged property, when no such obligation can ever be shown, you run into big problems with the consistency principle. By the very effect we talked about before with self-ownership, likewise, private property cannot be usurped by others.
Again, yes and no. This is where the elephant in the room, the social contract, comes into play. Now, I know that libertarians will simply stick their fingers in their ears and clench their eyes closed and refuse to acknowledge that such a thing exists, but they are just ignoring all the evidence to the contrary when they do so. The dictionary definition of the social contract is an implicit agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for social benefits, for example, by sacrificing some individual freedoms for state protection. Even philosophers like Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau admitted that the social contract was real, and these are some of the philosophers that libertarians quote all the time. Of course, like Christians reading the Bible, they pick and choose which parts to pay attention to and which parts to ignore. The social contract is implicit. It applies to you because you choose to remain within a society. It doesn't matter if you agree with it. It doesn't matter if you like it. It exists regardless. Now you can go kick and scream and hold your breath until you turn blue, as libertarians have many times before, but that doesn't change reality. It was a fundamental principle that the Founding Fathers incorporated into the foundation of this nation as a constitutional democratic republic. I don't care if you like it. Deal with reality.
So burden of proof in this context means only that you can prove that the person has an obligation based on positive action he himself has taken to agree with it. That's it.
Bullshit. You don't have to agree with the social contract any more than you have to agree with the law. But if you decide that you just don't want to respect those pesky laws about murder and you think you have a right to go around shooting people and destroying personal property or speeding or whatever the case may be, don't think for 1 second that a judge is going to look at you and say, "Oh yeah, you're right, you can ignore any of that." It's not how it works, no matter how much you wish that it did.
And that positive action cannot be the result of duress. Duress is an initiation of force, and so any contracts made under that force, or the threat of it, are automatically invalid. So from first principles, taxation is theft. Using force to take a portion of someone's wages denies the very concept of self-ownership, and therefore denies the principle of non-contradiction, and all of science and reason go with it.
Again, science says nothing about philosophy, and that alone makes this guy out of his freaking skull. Just stringing together a bunch of words that sound good to get an emotional reaction is not a rational way of making an argument. There are so many holes in this chain of reasoning that it's hard to take any of it seriously when you get to the end. I'm going to let the crazy libertarians in on a little secret, something that clearly they don't understand. Human society doesn't always operate based on the laws of logic. Yeah, I know, right? But you have unrealistic expectations that don't match up with the reality of the situation. Libertarians remind me of that nerdy kid with the glasses and the lisp who works out all the mathematics and the science behind why the prettiest girl in class ought to like him, and he's completely perplexed why she doesn't. The fact is, human society just doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way. It will never work that way. All the wishing in the world won't change that fact. This reminds me of Hume's is-ought problem, where people make arguments based on what they think ought to be the case instead of what is actually the case. Oh look, it's another logical fallacy!
That also makes the so-called social contract a failure right on the face of it. Even without having to go into what the courts have said about tacit consent and the rest, the social contract contravenes these very basic property rights, and since these rights are based on nothing more than first principles, the social contract fails right from the start. And you can't get around it by saying, but government built the roads you drive on. Remember, if it's done by force, it's duress, and the whole thing is invalid.
And that and a $5 bill will get you a latte at Starbucks. This is really ridiculous. You can build all of the theoretical philosophical models that you want, but at the end of the day, you have to deal with what's actually true. You people are proving yourselves incapable of doing that. This is why it looks just like a religion. You get the religious demanding that God exists. They have no evidence, they have no reasoning, and they just pretend that because they want it to be true, that it has to be true, and no amount of argumentation will ever change that. Libertarians live in a society where the social contract exists. In fact, there has never been a successful society in all of human history where it hasn't existed. It doesn't matter if it makes you happy or not. At the end of the day, you're going to have to deal with reality as it is, period. Learning to deal with reality on reality's terms is part of the basic maturation process. In other words, you people need to grow the fuck up.
The social contract is also a direct violation of the consistency principle, too. Whereas a normal contract requires positive mutual agreement and a meeting of the minds, the social contract gives special powers to a certain group of people known as the government. Powers we've shown they cannot possibly have in any way compatible with the consistency principle.
Except they do. And this brings us to the final laughable position of libertarians, the idea that the government is some alien entity imposed on humanity from outer space or something, that is taken over by force and is now imposing its will on the people. Nothing could be further from the truth, at least in a democratic republic like we have here. If you want to talk about a dictatorship, you might have a point, but libertarians, by and large, they don't live in dictatorships. So let me explain reality to you, and I'll go slow so I don't lose you. When the founding fathers of this nation wrote the Constitution, they didn't just impose it on the people. It was ratified by the people who went out and voted and decided that this document would guide the formation of the nation. As a citizen of this country, you are bound by the Constitution whether you like it or not. You don't get to vote on it. You don't get to opt out of it. It is the highest law of the land. The Constitution lays out the defining concepts and functions of the government in general terms, and it's certainly changed quite a bit over time, but that's a subject for another video. Collectively, the people vote on representatives who go to Washington or their state capitals or their local political centers or whatever, and make decisions on their behalf. If you like those decisions, you keep them in office. If you don't, you vote them out. Mostly, it's majority rule. The person with the most support gets the most votes and gets into office. But the problem with libertarians is they have virtually no popular support for their ideas. Nobody likes what they have to say, and because of that, none of their candidates get elected to high office, and therefore, none of their ideas get implemented. Most people know that their ideas are complete bullshit. That's why nobody takes them seriously, and they've never even gotten close to the 5% mark in a presidential election in more than 40 years that the National Party has existed. I think that somewhere deep down, this massive philosophical failure just pisses them off. So instead of realizing that their ideas are unpopular, they invent this giant conspiracy theory that this big alien government is conspiring against them to keep their obviously wonderful ideas down. And nothing could be further from the truth.
So there you have it. Property rights and the non-aggression principle stem directly from first principles. And statism, along with concepts such as wage slavery, the legitimacy of taxation, the social contract, labor theory of value, and pretty much everything else the state does, all violate first principles. Statists, your only way out of this is to try and show a flaw in the logic I've presented, where either some link in the chain of logic was skipped, or some fallacious reasoning was used somewhere. That's it. There is no empirical data, no emotional arguments, no amount of fear-mongering, no lifeboat scenario that will help you. Who will build the roads, or libertarians are selfish, or there's never been a libertarian society, will likewise do nothing. These are arguments from first principles. They cannot be denied.
Oh, brother. Of course they can be denied. I've already poked an endless array of holes in the arguments, showed them that these ideas themselves violate the first principles, etc. Of course, the libertarians, with their blind faith and utter adoration of these ideas, will never be honest enough to admit it, and frankly, I don't care because they will never have any real political power. The fact that there has never been a successful libertarian society in the history of man is actually important. It means that this system of political philosophy doesn't actually work. It has never attracted enough adherents to be taken seriously in any nation of any size, ever. Hell, they tried communism, but nobody's crazy enough to try libertarianism. I think that's pretty telling, don't you? In the end, it doesn't really matter how logically consistent an idea is if it doesn't actually work in the real world, and this is one of those things that simply doesn't work. This is an example of people thinking, but not thinking about what they're thinking. No matter how good of an idea any of this might be, it fails because it will never stand up to reality. It's like the crazy liberal idea that everyone in the world will magically put down their guns, join hands, and sing Kumbaya. It's like the crazy religious idea that everyone will magically convert to one particular sect of Christianity and the world will enter a golden age. Yeah, not so much. I've falsified so many of these ideas by providing exceptions that nobody in their right mind would ignore, and if these positions are not consistent, they violate first principles and are thus logically invalid. Of course, all I'll hear from libertarians is, no, it's not. Because they aren't really intellectual positions. They're emotional ones, dressed up in pseudo-logical clothes. It is a position adopted by the generally immature, people who have not yet learned how to deal with the real world as it is, rather than how they wish it was, and that, my friends, it's just not a rational position at all. Thanks for sticking around for this extended video. I think I've given enough attention to the libertarian position for a while. I really can't think of anything more to say that hasn't already been said, so unless I already have it in my queue, or I come across something that really intrigues me for some reason, this is likely the last video I'm going to do for a while. Of course, you never know. Maybe some libertarians might come up with an argument that's actually better than nuh-uh. But I'm not holding my breath. So, you know what to do. Leave me comments and all the rest below, and stick around. There's more coming up.